Zariah Robinson had faced death 1,000 times. As a high-trauma nurse, she had stood steady in the middle of chaotic emergency rooms, her hands never shaking as she stitched wounds that seemed impossible to close. She had looked into the eyes of the grieving and the broken for 10 years and never once let her own armor crack. But on this night, this strong, brilliant, and unbreakable black woman was sitting on the floor of a cold hospital corridor at 2 in the morning with nowhere left to turn. In a room just a few feet away, a 6-year-old girl named Chloe Sinclair lay dying. Chloe's own stepmother had stood in that ward just days ago, not to offer comfort, but to sign a paper that felt like a death warrant. With hands that didn't even tremble, she had whispered 5 words that would haunt Zariah forever. "I can't afford her anymore." Then, she simply walked away. Chloe had no one else. No family, no safety net, no hope, except for the secret Zariah had found hidden in the back of an old locker. A strange black business card with nothing but a phone number and a dragon symbol. Zariah knew that calling. This number was a choice she could never take back. She was a woman of science and service, but to save this child, she was about to summon a man who lived in the shadows. A powerful Korean boss, the kind of man whose name is whispered in fear across the city, a man with a dragon etched into his skin and a heart that was rumored to be made of ice. Her hands were shaking as she dialed. She was sacrificing her savings, her peace, and perhaps her safety for a girl she had only known for a week. When the line finally connected, the voice that answered was low, quiet, and dangerous, like a predator that had been waiting in the dark for years. What she said to him in that moment would trigger a chain of events that no one saw coming. What he did the moment he stepped through those hospital doors will break you completely. But what this Korean boss did the very next morning, alone, before anyone even had the chance to ask him, that is the moment this story becomes something you will never forget. Before we continue, comment below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories about abandoned innocence, unlikely heroes, and the power of a promise resonate with you, make sure to subscribe. Zariah had faced death 1,000 times. She had worked 48-hour shifts without stumbling and held the hands of the dying without flinching while the world crumbled around them. She had built her life on being the one who stays when everyone else runs. And yet, here she was, her back against a wall that smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. About to change Chloe's life, and her own forward. The sterile glow of the hospital's fluorescent lights had always felt like a shield to Zariah Robinson, a boundary between the chaos of the world and the precision of her care. But as she stood at the foot of bed 42, that shield shattered. Before her lay 6-year-old Chloe Sinclair, a child who seemed to be disappearing into the very sheets that held her. Chloe's frame was fragile and pale, her strength stolen by a body working too hard on the wrong things. A soft lilac beanie was pulled low over her bare head, a splash of gentle color against the harsh, clinical white of the ward. The thin oxygen tube beneath her nose hissed with a rhythmic, indifferent whisper. The only sound in a room that had suddenly become too quiet just moments ago. The space beside the bed had been occupied by Chloe's stepmother. Zariah had watched the woman throughout the week, waiting for a crack in her composure, a sign of the maternal agony that usually filled these corridors. Instead, there was only a cold, methodical detachment. The woman did not reach out to brush a stray hair from Chloe's forehead. She did not lean in to whisper a promise of a tomorrow. When the administrative clerk handed over the final discharge and transfer of responsibility papers, the stepmother's hands did not shake from grief, but from a desperate, hurried relief. Zariah watched in a state of rising horror as the pen met the paper. It was a clinical execution of a relationship. The woman signed her name with a sharp, final stroke, then looked up at Zariah with eyes that held no light. There was no apology in her voice, only a flat, terrifying pragmatism as she uttered the words that would settle into Zariah's chest like heavy sediment. "I can't afford her anymore." With that single sentence, the woman turned. There was no goodbye, no backward glance at the small girl who was still fighting for every breath. The sound of her heels clicking against the linoleum floor echoed down the corridor, growing fainter until it was swallowed by the hum of the hospital machinery. Zariah stood paralyzed in the wake of the abandonment, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked back at Chloe, who remained still, her small hand curled instinctively around the edge of her blanket. In a building where grief was ordinary, this was a brand of cruelty that felt entirely new. Chloe Sinclair had been stripped of everything but her name and the air being forced into her lungs. She had no one else left in the world. Except, as Zariah felt her resolve harden into something dangerous and sacrificial, the nurse who refused to flinch, the silence that followed the stepmother's departure was not empty. It was heavy, a suffocating weight that settled over bed 42 like a shroud. Zariah stood in the center of that silence, her gaze fixed on the small, rhythmic rise and fall of Chloe's chest. The hospital's administrative machinery began to turn almost immediately, indifferent to the tragedy of a child suddenly rendered a ward of the state. Within hours, the first collection of billing notices appeared at the nurse's station. Cold, black and white demands for a life that had just been declared unaffordable. Zariah did not hesitate. She picked up the first bill quietly, sliding it into her pocket before anyone else could see. She told herself it was a temporary bridge, a momentary act of sympathy for a girl who had no one else. But sympathy quickly spiraled into a grueling sacrifice. To keep the lights on in Chloe's room and the oxygen flowing through those thin tubes, Zariah began to systematically dismantle her own life. Her world became a blur of double shifts and stolen hours of sleep in the break room chair. She worked nights and mornings back to back, her body weakening even as her determination grew into something jagged and unbreakable. The vibrant, focused nurse who once moved through the wards with effortless grace was replaced by a woman whose eyes were permanently rimmed with red. Her skin sallow under the relentless fluorescent hum, the financial erosion was absolute. Her savings, painstakingly gathered over years of service, vanished into the hospital's insatiable ledger within weeks. Her paycheck was gone before she could even touch it, redirected to pharmacy costs and specialist consultations that Chloe's former family had abandoned. She stopped buying groceries, subsisting on stale cafeteria crackers and lukewarm coffee, her stomach a constant, gnawing reminder of the choice she was making, despite the fraying edges of her existence. Zariah never let the exhaustion touch the time she spent at Chloe's bedside. Every morning, she forced her trembling hands to be steady and her voice to be light. She would lean down, her breath catching at the side of those narrow, sharp eyes that seemed to hold a world of unspoken questions, and whisper the only promise she had left. "You're not alone, Chloe. I'm right here." She was pouring her own life force into the child, unaware that the sediment of her desperation was reaching a breaking point that no amount of overtime could fix. The hospital at 3 in the morning possessed a specific, haunting frequency, a low-level hum of machinery and the distant, rhythmic squeak of a janitor's cart that seemed to vibrate through Zariah's very bones. She sat in the vinyl chair beside bed 42, her spine stiff and her head light from a hunger she no longer had the energy to address. The extra shifts had begun to bleed into one another, turning her world into a seamless loop of fluorescent lights and the sharp, clinical smell of antiseptic that now lived in her hair and skin. Her body was weakening, her muscles aching with a deep, structural fatigue that no amount of caffeine could reach. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the cold, final stroke of a pen on an abandonment form. Zariah reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the lilac beanie that had slipped sideways on Chloe's head. The little girl remained terrifyingly still, her skin almost translucent under the ward's unforgiving glow. Chloe's breathing was shallow and careful, a fragile effort that made Zariah's own breath catch in her throat. She was a child whose body was working far too hard on the wrong things, fighting a battle that her own family had decided wasn't worth the cost. In the quiet of the pre-dawn hour, when the rest of the world was asleep and the hospital felt like an island adrift in a dark sea, Zariah leaned closer to the bed. She took Chloe's small, pale hand in both of hers, marveling at how light it felt, as if the girl were already half gone. The weight of her secret sacrifice pressed against her sternum like a second heartbeat, a heavy sediment of desperation that she refused to let Chloe feel. "You're not alone," Zariah whispered, her voice a soft, fractured thread in the silence. She repeated it like a prayer, a ritual of structure against the quiet desperation of the ward. "I'm right here, Chloe. I've got you." Chloe didn't wake, but her small fingers curled instinctively around Zariah's thumb, holding on with a certainty that broke Zariah's heart. It was the uncomplicated trust of a child who had no reason to doubt that the person she reached for would still be there. Zariah stayed that way for hours, her back against the hard plastic of the chair, ignoring the way her vision blurred and her pulse hammered in her ears. She was pouring her own life into the silence of the room. Anchored by a promise she was no longer sure she had the strength to keep, the gray dawn of another double shift filtered through the hospital windows. But for Zariah, the world had never looked darker. She stood in the narrow break room, her fingers trembling as she stared at the glowing screen of her phone. The numbers on her banking app were static and cold, a final, unyielding zero that signaled the end of her hidden crusade. Every cent of her savings, the emergency fund she had spent a decade building, and the entirety of her last 3 paychecks had been swallowed by the hospital's insatiable ledger. She had dismantled her own life to keep Chloe's flickering flame alive, but she had finally reached the bedrock of her own poverty. A soft knock at the door startled her. It was the billing coordinator, a woman whose face usually carried the same clinical indifference as the antiseptic-soaked walls. She held a new invoice, the paper crisp and terrifyingly white. The next round of specialized hematology treatments was scheduled for that afternoon, a treatment Chloe desperately needed to stay ahead of the shallow, careful breathing that terrified Zariah every night. Without it, the 6 months or less the doctors had whispered would start to collapse into weeks, then days. Zariah took the paper, her vision blurring as she looked at the figure at the bottom. It was a sum she couldn't reach, not with 10 more double shifts. Not with her body already vibrating from a structural fatigue that felt like it might snap her bones. The determination that had acted as her armor for weeks finally cracked. She thought of the stepmother's signature, that sharp, final stroke that had declared Chloe unaffordable, and a sickening wave of guilt washed over her. She had promised the girl she wasn't alone. But as she stood in the buzzing silence of the break room, Zariah realized that love and sacrifice were no longer enough to pay the gatekeepers of Chloe's survival. She walked back to bed 42, her legs feeling heavy, like they were moving through sediment. Chloe was awake, her lilac beanie slightly crooked as she stared at the ceiling panels. When the little girl turned those narrow, sharp eyes toward her, Zariah felt a physical ache behind her ribs. She forced a smile, the most difficult thing she had ever had to do, and took the child's small, pale hand. The reality of her failure pressed cold against her sternum, a truth she wasn't ready to whisper. She had reached the bottom of her account, and for the first time in her career, the unbreakable nurse found herself staring into a void she could not bridge. The locker room was a narrow, dim corridor of dented metal and the lingering scent of stale coffee. A place where exhaustion usually went to hide for 10 minutes before the next shift began. Zariah moved with the heavy, uncoordinated steps of someone whose body had long since forgotten the feeling of rest. Her hands, usually so steady in the emergency room, fumbled with the combination of her locker, the metal clattering loudly in the oppressive quiet. She needed to clear out her things. The reality of her empty bank account meant she could no longer afford the commute, let alone the life she had tried to sustain for Chloe. As she reached into the dark back corner of the metal cubicle to retrieve a forgotten stethoscope, her fingers brushed against something cold and unnervingly smooth. She pulled it out, expecting a stray piece of plastic, but found herself staring at a heavy, matte black business card. There was no company name, no address, and no title. In the center, embossed in a deep, shimmering gold that seemed to catch the meager light, was a single, coiled dragon. The memory hit her like a physical blow. 7 years ago, she had worked a private, off-the-books shift for a man who didn't officially exist, a fixer named Park D-Jim who operated on the fringes of the city's power. After the night was over, he had handed her this card with a voice as quiet as a grave, telling her it was a debt that could only be called in once. At the time, she had tucked it away, certain she would never be the kind of person who needed the help of a man called the Dragon. But as she looked at the card now, the dragon's gold eyes seemed to mock her carefully constructed independence. She thought of the hospital's insatiable ledger and the thin oxygen tube that was the only thing keeping Chloe anchored to this world. The pride that had been her armor for a decade felt suddenly like a hollow, brittle shell. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a woman standing on the edge of a precipice, holding the hand of a child who was about to fall. Zariah leaned her forehead against the cold metal of the locker, the black card pressed firmly against her palm. The card felt heavy, a remnant of a mystery she had spent years trying to forget. But in the silence of the locker room, it was the only bridge left. Her back was against the wall, her strength nearly gone, and for the first time, she allowed herself to accept that some battles were too big to be fought with just a paycheck and a prayer. The locker room was silent, the air heavy with the scent of metallic dust and the faint, persistent hum of the hospital's life support systems. Zariah sat on the cold bench, the black business card pressed so hard into her palm that the edges left a small red line in her skin. It was 2 a.m, the hour when grief in hospitals became so ordinary it was almost invisible. Yet for Zariah, it was the moment of absolute reckoning. Her phone screen was a blinding rectangle of light in the dim room as she stared at the number she had promised herself she would never dial. Her hands were shaking, a physical manifestation of the fear she had suppressed through weeks of double shifts and empty bank accounts. She thought of Chloe, pale and fragile under her lilac beanie, and the thin oxygen tube that whispered a truth no child should face alone. The pride that had been her armor for 10 years finally cracked, replaced by the specific, terrible weight of a woman who had run out of miracles. With both thumbs, she typed the digits, her heart hammering against her ribs like a second heartbeat. The line did not ring. It simply connected, a heavy, dangerous silence filling the space where a greeting should have been. Zariah closed her eyes, her back against the cold metal of the locker as she forced her voice to be steadier than she deserved. When the voice finally came through low, quiet, and certain, like it had been waiting for this call for years, she felt the air leave her lungs. Yes, the voice said, a single syllable that carried the gravity of a man who never wasted time on the parts of a situation he could not immediately use. Zariah swallowed hard, the antiseptic smell of the corridor suddenly cloying in her throat. There's a little girl here, she whispered, her voice a fractured thread in the dark locker room. She has no one else. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. A pause that felt like the internal mathematics of a moment he had never been given the chance to prepare for. Name, the voice demanded, denser and more controlled than anything she remembered. Chloe Sinclair, Zariah replied. Across the city, the hum of the world seemed to stop. Zariah sat on the floor, counting the panels on the ceiling, waiting for the bridge she had just built to either hold her or collapse. Then, the command came, quiet and absolute. Stay with her. I'm coming. Double quotes. In a high-rise office where the architecture was built of gold and deep shadow, Kang Min-seok stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city spread below him like a circuit board. He was a man who took up precisely the amount of space he chose to and no more, his presence carrying the particular gravity of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. The world saw him as a powerful Korean boss, a man with a dragon tattooed up his neck and eyes that seemed to possess the world with a cold, unhurried attention. He was a man who did not waste time on things he could not immediately use. But when his phone vibrated against his mahogany desk, the rhythm of his evening fractured. He had answered the call with a voice that was low, quiet, and certain, the voice of a man who treated silence like a room he was comfortable in. But when the nurse's voice came through the line, fractured and desperate, speaking of a little girl who had no one else, the controlled atmosphere of the room shifted. Then came the name, Chloe Sinclair. Min-seok froze. It was a name he had promised himself he would never hear again. A name tied to a secret that had been filed away in the internal mathematics of his past. His sharp eyes hardened, something rare and unsettling flickering behind them, a flash of recognition, as though he had suddenly seen a version of himself he thought he had left behind 7 years ago. The name was not just a piece of data. It was a weight that accumulated instantly, carrying the heavy sediment of a history he had not been given the chance to prepare for. He didn't ask for an explanation or a reason why the girl was alone. He simply stared at the city breathing behind him and felt the specific, irreversible quality of a moment that could not be undone. The existence of this child was a truth that had finally found its way home, a variable he had removed from his calculations years ago that was now demanding to be acknowledged. His jaw set with the specific tension of a person who had been holding himself together for a very long time. With a voice that was flatter and more absolute than before, he gave the command that would dismantle the careful architecture of his solitude. "Stay with her," he said, his words landing with the weight of an operational reality that was already in motion. "I'm coming." The rain began to fall over Seattle with a particular resignation, a low gray sky conducting itself with the heavy silence of a city that had long since made its peace with the damp. Inside the hospital, the ordinary machinery of a place where people came to be saved continued its indifferent operation. The fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above Zariah as she sat in the vigil she had refused to leave. But the quiet of the 2 a.m. corridor was suddenly shattered by a sound that did not belong in a house of healing, the synchronized heavy thrum of high-performance engines through the glass of the main entrance. The night was pierced by the cold, white glare of multiple headlights. A fleet of high-end black cars swept into the circular drive, moving with a focused dedication that suggested a calculated risk was being taken. They did not park so much as occupy the space surrounding the entrance with the particular brand of confidence worn by those who do not ask for invitations. The hospital staff, accustomed to the slow, predictable rhythm of the graveyard shift, felt a wave of panic ripple through the lobby. Security guards hesitated, caught in the specific tension of seeing something move too quickly for most people to catch. From the lead vehicle stepped a man who did not look like he had just crossed the city in a fever. He looked composed and unhurried, taking up precisely the amount of space he chose to and no more. He wore a dark coat over a sharp suit, his jaw set with the kind of weight that accumulates when a person is doing the internal mathematics of a moment they were never given the chance to prepare for. As he walked through the sliding doors, the lobby fell into a heavy, dangerous silence. The dragon tattooed up his neck was visible even in the dim light. A symbol of the world. Zariah had been afraid of a world of men who moved through rooms without making noise and possessed a gravity that demanded obedience without a raised voice. He did not stop for the reception desk or the frantic whispers of the nurses. He moved toward the elevators with a certainty that suggested the architecture of this building was already processed and filed in his mind. The beast had arrived, not with the anger Zariah might have handled, but with a deliberate, functional stillness that made the air in the corridor feel suddenly very thin. The heavy, rhythmic click of Minseek's boots against the linoleum was the only sound in the corridor, a sound that seemed to compress the very air of the ward into something denser and more dangerous. Zariah stood by the doorframe, her breath hitching as the man who had been a myth on a business card materialized in the sterile light. He did not look at her. His unhurried attention was fixed entirely on bed 42. He stopped at the threshold, his dark coat still holding the chill of the Seattle rain. And for a moment, the powerful Korean boss simply stood still, his jaw set with a specific tension that betrayed the functional mask he wore. In the center of the bed, Chloe was awake, her small frame looking impossibly fragile beneath the hospital sheets. She regarded the tall man with the dragon climbing his neck with the same direct, unblinking assessment that Zariah had seen her apply to every stranger. The lamb did not flinch. Instead, she adjusted her lilac beanie with a trembling hand and looked up into eyes that were narrow, sharp, and deeply, unmistakably like her own. Minseok moved to the bedside, his presence taking up precisely the amount of space he chose to and no more. He looked down at the child he had not known existed until a few hours ago, and something moved across his face fast, almost invisible, a flash of recognition that only someone as observant as a trauma nurse could catch. He saw the way her fingers curled instinctively around the edge of the blanket. A gesture of stubbornness he recognized in his own reflection. "You're very tall," Chloe said, her voice thin and blurred by the hiss of the oxygen tube but carrying a surprising weight of certainty. Min Seok sat in the hard plastic chair Zariah had occupied for weeks, treating the silence like a room he was comfortable in. He reached out, his large, scarred hand hovering for a second before he allowed it to settle near her small one. "You're very small," he replied, his voice low and quiet, not cold, but possessing the stillness of deep water. In that moment, the predator and the innocent were linked by a truth that had finally found its way home. A variable Min Seok was no longer willing to remove from his calculation. The air in the room seemed to hold its breath as Min Seok's unhurried attention shifted from the child to the woman standing in the doorway. Zariah felt the specific, irreversible quality of the moment, a weight that had been accumulating since she first dialed the number on that mad black card. Min Seok did not waste time on the parts of the situation he could not immediately use. He spoke with a voice that was low and quiet, carrying the heavy sediment of a history Zariah was only beginning to understand. "You asked why I came," he said, his eyes narrow and sharp, reflecting a recognition that felt unsettlingly like a mirror to the girl in the bed. He reached into the pocket of his dark coat and pulled out a small, weathered photograph, placing it on the bedside table beside Chloe's lilac beanie. It was a picture of a man Zariah recognized from the intake forms Chloe's biological father. The man the stepmother had never spoken of with anything but cold detachment, years ago, in the basement restaurants of Gangnam where the lighting was amber and the menus had no prices. Min Seok had been a man walking into risks with his eyes open. He had been caught in a world of bullets cutting through air that was never meant to hold them, a world where he had nearly been erased. It was Chloe's father, a man who lived on the fringes of things that did not officially exist, who had pulled him from the rubble. He had not flinched, not once, risking his own life to ensure the dragon survived the night. "A Sinclair saved my life before anyone asked him to," Min Seok whispered, his voice steady and absolute. "He died protecting a world he didn't belong to, leaving behind a debt that has no sustainable place to land until now." He looked back at Chloe, whose hand was still curled around the edge of the blanket with an instinctive certainty. The truth of her parentage wasn't just a biological fact. It was a blood debt. A variable Min Seok had processed and filed away until Zariah's call brought it back to the surface. Zariah watched them, feeling the specific terrible grief of realizing that the story she had told herself to survive, that she was alone in this fight, had finally developed a crack it would not recover from. Min Seok wasn't here out of charity. He was here because the architecture of his world required him to protect the only living piece of the man who had kept his own heart beating. The dragon had come to claim the lamb, and for the first time in weeks, Zariah felt her own knees want to do something embarrassing as the weight of the sacrifice finally began to shift. The hospital's ordinary machinery, which had hummed with an indifferent, rhythmic buzzing for weeks, was silenced in a matter of minutes. Kang Min Seok did not raise his voice, yet the air in the corridor seemed to compress under the weight of his authority as his team moved through the ward. He was a man who decided most things, and he had decided that the sterile, gray resignation of this public wing was no longer a place for a Sinclair. Within the hour, the beast had cleared the entire floor, his men moving through the rooms without making noise, replacing the hospital's standard security with a particular gravity that demanded absolute obedience. Zariah watched from the doorway as the medical landscape she knew began to dismantle and rebuild itself. The tired, overextended staff were replaced by a specialized unit that arrived with the focused dedication of people who had been waiting for this call. At the head of the group was a quiet woman named Dr. Shin, a physician who reviewed every document with a thoroughness that suggested she learned long ago never to trust another's assessment. She did not look at the billing codes or the insurance status. She looked only at Chloe, her narrow, sharp eyes mirroring Min Seok's own functional stillness. The transition was absolute and unhurried. High-end medical equipment, bearing logos Zariah had only seen in specialized journals, was wheeled into Bed 42E's new private sanctuary. The thin oxygen tube that had whispered Chloe's fragile truth was replaced by a silent, state-of-the-art system that hummed with a different kind of certainty. Min Seok stood in the center of the transformation, taking up precisely the amount of space he chose to, his dark coat a sharp contrast to the new, warm amber lighting he had ordered to replace the flickering fluorescent glow. Zariah felt her own role shifting, the specific, irreversible quality of her sacrifice finally finding a place to land. She was no longer the sole anchor for a child who had no one else. She was now a witness to a debt being paid in full. As Dr. Shin began her examination, Min Seok turned to Zariah, his voice low and quiet, not cold, but possessing the stillness of deep water. "She stays in this wing," he said, his words landing with the weight of an operational reality that left no room for qualification. "And you stay with her, for the first time in 10 years. Zariah felt the heavy sediment of exhaustion in her chest develop a crack. Realizing that the dragon had not just brought doctors, he had brought a fortress, the cold, sterile peace of the newly secured wing was shattered not by a medical emergency, but by the sharp, clicking rhythm of heels that Zariah recognized with a sickening jolt of memory. The stepmother had returned, her face no longer wearing the flat, terrifying pragmatism of abandonment, but a frantic, calculated gleam. Word of the high-end black cars and the specialized medical unit had traveled fast through the hospital's whispered networks, reaching her like a scent on the wind. She burst through the double doors, her eyes scanning the transformed corridor with a greed that was almost visible, until they settled on bed 42. "I heard there was a misunderstanding," she began, her voice pitched in a practiced, fluttering tone of concern that didn't reach her cold eyes. She moved toward Chloe with her hands outstretched, as if the last week of silence and the finality of her signature had never occurred. "I'm her legal guardian. I'm here to take my daughter home now that her benefactor has arrived." Zariah stepped forward, her exhaustion replaced by a jagged, protective heat, but she was stopped by a low, quiet sound that carried the weight of an approaching storm. Kang Min Seok stepped out from the shadows of the private sanctuary, his dark coat unbuttoned, the dragon on his neck appearing to coil in the amber light. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood in the center of the corridor, taking up precisely the amount of space he chose to and no more. The stepmother froze, her calculated smile faltering under the pressure of his unhurried attention. Min Seok did not waste time on the parts of the situation he could not immediately use. He pulled a single piece of paper from his pocket, the discharge form she had signed with such desperate relief just days ago. "You signed a truth," he said, his voice flat and absolute, possessing the stillness of deep water. "You said you could no longer afford her. I have processed that statement. I have filed it, and I have accepted it." When she tried to speak of rights and bloodlines, Min Seok took a single step closer, a movement so controlled it was more terrifying than an outburst. "Forgiveness is for things that are over," he whispered, his sharp eyes pinning her to the wall. "This is not over. You didn't just leave a child. You left a Sinclair. And in my world, we do not let our debts go unpaid." The woman looked at the dragon climbing his neck, then at the silent, stone-faced man standing behind him, and realized she was staring into a void she could not bridge. She turned and fled, her heels echoing down the linoleum for the last time, leaving the ward to a silence that was no longer empty, but inhabited. The new amber glow of the ward was meant to be a comfort, yet as Zariah watched the silent, stone-faced men guarding the perimeter of the hallway, it felt unsettlingly like a cage. She stood by the window, watching the rain conduct itself over the city with a low-gray resignation, while behind her, Dr. Shin's team worked with a quiet, unhurried precision that Zariah's old life could never have afforded. Chloe was breathing easier, the state-of-the-art monitors doing their steady, indifferent work, but the cost of that breath was beginning to weigh on Zariah's conscience. She had summoned a dragon to protect a lamb, but as she looked at the tattoo coiling up Min Seok's neck, she wondered if she had simply traded one kind of danger for another. Min Seok sat in the chair beside the bed, his dark coat cast aside, watching Chloe with the full unhurried attention of a man who was no longer waiting for his turn to speak. He looked at home in the silence, but Zariah saw the shadows he brought with him, the men who moved through rooms without making noise, and the particular gravity of a world where power was the only currency. She had been afraid of the wrong things for weeks, afraid of poverty and abandonment, but now she was afraid of the atmosphere Chloe would grow up in. Would the child be shaped by the dragon's world in ways Zariah could not protect her from? Would this fortress eventually collapse onto the very person it was built to save? Zariah turned from the window, her voice a soft thread in the quiet room. "She's a child, Min Seok," she said, her exhaustion finally finding words. "She needs a life that isn't built on debts and shadows. Is this a sanctuary? Or is it just a beautiful prison?" Min Seok didn't look away from Chloe, his jaw set with the specific tension of a man who had already processed every variable. "I decide most things," he said without arrogance, his voice low and quiet like deep water. "I have decided she will be safe. The shape of that safety is my burden, not hers." Zariah watched them, the man who lived in the dark and the girl who had become his light, and felt the irreversible quality of the roots taking hold. She had spent 10 years being the one who stayed when others ran, but now she had to decide if staying meant becoming something she didn't recognize. The machines continued their indifferent rhythm, providing the air Chloe needed to survive, while Zariah stood in the center of a world that was moving too quickly for her to catch. Wondering if the beast could ever truly provide a home for a lamb, the transition from the sterile, gray resignation of the hospital to the vibrant, ember-lit pulse of soul happened with the unhurried precision that defined Kang Min Seok. It was no longer a question of survival, but of learning how to stay in a life that was finally anchored. The private jet had long since landed, and the hum of the medical monitors had been replaced by the quiet, sophisticated machinery of a high-rise apartment overlooking the Han River. In this new world, the architecture of their lives was built not of antiseptic and quiet desperation, but of safety and a silence that felt inhabited. Zariah stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her hand pressed flat against the cool glass as she watched the city spread below like a circuit board. The structural fatigue that had vibrated through her bones for months had finally begun to settle, leaving behind a lightness she hadn't felt in a decade. She was no longer a woman running from a debt or a nurse breaking under the weight of a secret sacrifice. The exhaustion that had been her constant companion had evaporated, replaced by the full, unhurried attention she could now give to a future that wasn't measured in 6-month countdowns. Behind her, the sound of a small, unguarded laugh rippled through the room. Chloe was sitting on a plush rug, her lilac beanie cast aside to reveal the healthy growth of new hair. She was telling Min Seok a story about her rabbit, Thursday, and why he desperately needed a friend named Friday. Min Seok sat beside her, his dark coat removed, the dragon on his neck visible but no longer a symbol of fear. He listened with the kind of recognition that had once unsettled Zariah but now felt like the only truth worth holding onto. Zariah realized then that she had been running in the wrong direction for a long time, thinking that protection meant solitude. But as Min Seok's low, calm voice joined Chloe's laughter, she understood that she had finally walked into a story that was allowed to last. The dragon had not just provided a donor or a fortress. He had provided a home where a Sinclair and a Robinson were no longer alone. She turned away from the window, leaving the city lights behind, and walked toward the sound of the family she had accidentally built, a story of redemption that was now, finally, complete.